we'll get started with the session. We only have 1 hour for this panel discussion, and so we'll just get started immediately. Very briefly, I'll introduce the chair of the session. This is Isito A, and co-chair Wayne Powell, and then myself, Shobha Shivashankar, two of us from the CGIAR and ANAFE for ICITO. Now, the panel discussion is going to be rapporteurs. Well, we have our rapporteurs. Delia is over there, and who else is helping us? John is doing the panel, and Ido. Ido is doing that. Thank you, Ido. So Delia and Ido are the rapporteurs for the afternoon. And so for our panel, we're going to be starting off with the panelists themselves, and then we'll come to specific questions that we want to feed into our delivery to the GCARD 3 declaration as collective actions. But I will guide that in just a second. I want to introduce our panelists here. We have Moses Osiro from Reforum. I'm just going to go through here. From IMI, Jeremy Bird is replaced by Chris Dickens here. Ian Mao, Vice President for Food, Agriculture and Natural Resources from APLU. We have Didier Pillow from AgriNatura, and then at the very end we have John Connolly from the University of Alberta. So what we're going to do here today is to have each of the panelists give a brief introduction of their background and then give their perception about the morning sessions as to what they see are the most important concerns and important issues that need to be taken forward. And after that, I will bring up a few questions to guide the discussions from the floor, and we'll add more questions to that. But the ultimate aim is to come out with solid recommendations that can go into the GCARD 3 declaration. So with that, I start off with Moses to give a brief introduction and also his perception on the morning session.
Thank you, Dr. Shobha. So first of all, a brief introduction. So Moses Osiro is my name, as Shobha has mentioned. I am currently the Deputy Executive Secretary at Reforum. In terms of my background, I'm a plant pathologist by training. Previously working with ICRISAT in Malawi as well as in Mali as a regional plant pathologist, but also with what Bioversity, but at that time was the INIBAP program of IPGRI that became Bioversity. I also worked for some time in the Ministry of Agriculture in Uganda in a program called the Plan for Modernization of Agriculture in Uganda. Now, in terms of my perception, and I've been told to keep it to 3 minutes, so I'll try and focus on one or two things. Firstly, my reading from all that was shared is that there's certainly a lot of what's coming out in terms of the potential of the technologies and the successes that is coming out of work from the CG as well as from other partners. But there certainly also is a mismatch between the narrative that we're hearing here and the narrative that we hear about Africa in terms of deepening poverty and in terms of a lack of scaling out of some of the important research and successes that the CG and other partners have. So it was also highlighted in terms of challenges particularly in Africa with regards to weak institutions, lack of human resource, as well as other types of, for example, infrastructure and resources to undertake as well as to support the type of work that would be required to scale out and deepen the impact of some of the work that's coming out of the CG. So some of my perceptions are, one is we need to think a lot more about the role of the university. We all understand the university as having a role. The three normal areas are given as research, training, and outreach or having impact within the community. But there's also another role of the university, which is to ensure that knowledge is maintained from generation to generation, that there's a transfer of knowledge from one generation to the other generation. Now, specifically in Africa, there's been a huge growth and expansion in the university sector. Some of you know that in the 1970s, some of the countries had maybe 2,000 students within the university sector and maybe largely only one university. Today, many countries, if you take, for example, Ethiopia, Ghana, maybe even Uganda, most of them have over 200,000 students within the university sector. So my question is, how can this capacity be harnessed to do some of the work that we're thinking of now in terms of linking with the CG as a partner to deepen impact of the work that we have here? The other quick issue is that there's a growing trend in many parts of the world to narrow the gap between research and training. And we've seen, of course, the land grant model from the US from a long time ago, but also many countries in Europe now, the Netherlands, for example, as well as maybe Denmark, that have actually come to a closer merger between the research and education sectors. The third thing is to say that there are also very many interesting things happening in universities today. You have many experiences that can be built on. There are a lot of centers of centers of excellence, a centers of leadership approach that is being used to ensure that some of this capacity that we're talking about that is missing can be built. For example, the World Bank Centers of Excellence program that has recently been initiated to strengthen skills, specific skills that are required to support some of this value chain type work that we've been discussing in this meeting. I also wanted to mention some of also the partnerships between the CG and universities. So for example, within the Dryland Cereals program, Ruforum, but also Apari and Waki in West Africa have been working with the CRP to support putting into the CG students at postdoc, at PhD, as well as at MSc level, to ensure that they can benefit from the infrastructure, the mentorship that is available within the CG centers. Maybe just one more to say in terms of also harnessing the students within the university as either an extension force, but also looking at the shrinking employment sector within the public sector, that now many employment opportunities are probably rather in the private rather than the public. There are also many programs that are focusing on entrepreneurship within universities and also trying to get students to come out more as job creators rather than as people who expect to get employment. So to summarize that, or to maybe make a final call to say, I think what we're looking for is a greater collaboration between the CG, or between research and universities. Secondly, to focus on identifying what are those skills that are required to support the type of scaling out that we now need based on the successes that are available. And then thirdly, to think about also the youth and the employment, particularly looking for entrepreneurs rather than those who are looking for employment when they finish with their education, so that the youth bulge in Africa can actually be harnessed for development. Thank you.
Sorry. You want to go right down the line?
Yes.
Good afternoon, everybody. I hope we can keep you awake during the session after lunch. My take on this morning was, well, let me tell you a little bit about me. I'm an individual that failed retirement at once. I'm on my second stint, if you will. I spent 34 years in higher education at Rutgers University, at which time I spent the majority of that a little over 2 decades in administration as Dean of Academic and Student Affairs. Rutgers had its ag school of over 3,000 undergraduate students and about 700 or 800 graduate students across the disciplines. While it came from the roots of ag and environmental science, the scope of the academic programs at Rutgers that was under my aegis was much broader than that and included much of the biological sciences, including microbiology and biochemistry, as well as the traditional sciences that we all find in agriculture, soil science, agronomy, etc. So much so that Rutgers, in more recent history, over the last 5 or 6 years, has really taken over all the biological sciences and is now known as the School of Biological Sciences rather than the old college moniker that we had. In terms of the sessions this summer or this morning, I think they were very interesting, and there were a number of takes away from that I think posed some questions for us, and Moses has certainly hit on some of those topics, and I don't want to repeat those. But one of the questions that I have is, as we move forward, what is indeed our common agenda? Do we really have that? And as GFAR works together and the roadmap, is that a common agenda that we really all do buy into and have ownership of and are going to be willing to support? All of our institutions, and particularly our universities, and even in the public sector, in the arenas that we work, are facing another crisis, and it's a crisis of succession. When we look at the industry, and certainly within our universities, we see that aging population. And what we are facing in the United States right now is that we are not graduating enough students at the undergraduate level, or even master's and PhD, to fill the jobs that are there. We are falling terribly short. Just at the undergraduate level, when we consider all of our ag schools across the U.S., we're facing an annual shortage of over 25,000 students for the jobs that are out there. So one of our challenges is, how do we get more students interested in the very diverse world of agriculture that we have today? And once we get them, how do we keep them? One other startling statistic is we're doing a very good job in training PhDs, no question about that. But in academia, we find that when we get the PhDs, only about 40% of them stay in academic institutions. Most of them move to the private sector. So that's a big issue for us too. And certainly as I look down my faculty list, I referred to it as my birthday list that I always kept in my top drawer of my desk. One of the things I had to look at each year was, how many faculty am I going to lose through retirement? And how am I going to replace them, and where am I going to find them? So that's an issue. One of the real things that I came away with in terms of this morning was really something I would pose to all of you as really as a question. And that is this: in what way are the research priorities really aligned with the education priorities of our institution? Are they aligned? How do we know that they are aligned? And are they aligned in a way that's going to enhance the human and institutional capacities that we are going to need to meet the development challenges that are before us? That's a question I don't have the answer to, but it's one that I think we really have to plumb. Do we have shared agendas really between our research priorities and those in education? And are they owned by each? And if so, how is that manifest in the daily work that we do and in setting our own agendas moving forward in our institutions? I'm going to leave it at that and pass it on.
Right, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Chris Dickens. I'm from the International Water Management Institute, and I'm actually standing in for Jeremy Bird, who's the DG of IMI, who couldn't be here, and he sends his apologies. Personally, I head up the regional office, the Southern African regional office, basically covering the SADC area. By training, I'm an ecologist. I work with water resources and ecosystems. So I bring in a sort of the natural resource side into this whole agricultural idea. I think, for me, the thing that really stood out this morning was this whole issue of capacity, and I think there's the capacity shortage actually comes up in many ways. I think the first is actually within officialdom and those people who actually implement policies and so on. if I can give South Africa as an example, that when we had this amazing political transition, and the fantastic thing about it was that we had the opportunity to just dump all of the policy and write it all again from scratch. And it was a unique opportunity. And what happened is that people in the know were brought together and wrote the most brilliant policy. They then handed that over to officials to now implement. And the trouble is that the officials don't value the outputs of science. In general, I'm generalizing hugely. So they look at the policies and they look at the science that is supposed to be done to actually provide information to implement the policies, and they dismiss it quite often. And so the value of science isn't carried through, even though it's required to by policy. It doesn't really get carried through by officials and onto the ground. And so if there's something that we can do to actually encourage the improvement in the valuation of science by officials, particularly in countries across Africa, I think that would be really useful. And then when it comes down to the students, just now I think Moses said that we need to sort of link research and academia, but we also then need to link that to the needs on the ground as well. I think education is failing society to an extent, and that it still remains a sort of a backroom, laboratory, dusty, book-orientated kind of approach to gaining knowledge, which is so removed from the real world in many respects. And yes, we try to have practical experiments and things like that, but somehow we don't actually enable students to take ownership of subjects. Students have to feel passionate and have to actually get involved in a subject and take ownership of a subject if they're actually going to carry on with it. And in a way, these hundreds of thousands of students in each country is actually a bit worrying, because are all of those students actually really going to take ownership of the knowledge and the jobs and the issues that are facing society? If they do, that's fantastic. But I hope we're not seeing universities just as sausage machines, getting people to pass exams and throwing them out into society. We don't need that. We somehow need to transition into actually getting students involved in solutions to the world, and not just in learning piles of facts and passing exams. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Didier Pilot, and actually I'm working in a university of agriculture in the south of France, in Montpellier, but I'm also vice president of AgriNatura, which is the association of agricultural universities in Europe that have a special concern with tropical agriculture and agricultural research for development. Let's say it short like that. So we gather a number of university experiences that are in Europe, so far from the field of ARD, but still very much concerned by producing the competences and skills that can be relevant with the needs of the South. And listening to the presentations that were done this morning here, but also in the main session, I was thinking that indeed, like you say, the question of renewal of the generations of people, when I see those young people taking the floor and speaking about their commitment on development like they did, I'm feeling that, yes, the new generation is on track, and that we're on the good way. But in the meantime, I also realize that we have a full generation of scientists and development specialists to replace. Those people who have been trained in the 60s and the 70s with a special professional experience that they had at that moment, and who have the capacity to take the problems globally when there are problems of development, and to develop specific research programs on what are the constraints that the development organizations or the farmers locally can confront. And because of the history of their career, they have had a special capacity to to have a broad view, inclusive view of agriculture and the constraint that can arise in a specific situation. I think that now producing that kind of skills by our universities is much more difficult indeed than it used to be 30 years ago. I'm looking to my own university and the universities of my association, and I see how much the academic system is pushing forward the young trainees into specializing in their discipline, going in the forefront of the science, which is good indeed. But the more they go in that direction, the less, in many cases, they have the capacity to look at their precise contribution within a global, inclusive vision of the needs and of the problems that can exist in a complex agricultural system. It's, as it was said this morning, agriculture is complex. It cannot be limited to a problem in soil science or in genetic progress or even in climate. It is something that embeds the social conditions, the natural conditions, and training on this issue is quite complex. So the conclusion that I draw from that is that we are confronting at least two levels of problem. One level is the massive training that Moses mentioned at the beginning. 200,000 students, you said, I don't know for which scale of countries, but a huge number of students that are going to be trained, or that needs to be trained. And indeed, the multiplication of the institutions in charge of this higher education may have generated in many cases that there is less linkage between the education within the walls of the university and the real world outside the university. And that, of course, situations are different from one place to the other. There are experiences also where you see some experiences of capacity building where there are strong linkages between what the development institutions do on the field and what is trained within the walls of the university. But this should be mainstreamed much more than it is currently. And if we have an action to propose within this framework of GCARD, I would very strongly support the idea that universities on that side, research institutions also present on the field, and development organizations, whatever they're farmers organizations or NGO, civil society, build together some actions that can help strengthening the link between the universities and the real world. Through internships, through contributions of those professionals within the training, etc., etc. The second challenge is not the 200,000 students, Moses, but the 10% of them who will be the champions in research and in organizing development action at a high level. And in many cases, this goes through individual training, through PhD, and indeed, how much of our research in the research organizations is done by ourselves and what is done by PhD students. So the fact that PhD is important for the renewal of the generation, I think there are a number of topics which are not a problem. We have in the universities the capacity to train in genomics within the labs properly to address the needs in the front science. When we deal with development issues, land management, innovation within societies, this is much more difficult. And this raises a special concern for a system that could address more the needs for higher education and preparing the competences in this regard. that could be also another domain for collective action within the GCART.
Hey, thank you. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is John Connolly from the University of Alberta in Canada. And just briefly on my background is in animal science, and I recently completed 10 years as Dean of the Faculty of Agricultural Life and Environmental Sciences at the U of A. Recently, or actually 2 years ago, I became president of CGIAR. And CGIAR, I think, is relevant to our discussion here in that its membership are associations that represent agriculture and life sciences universities globally. So our members association actually represent 900 universities worldwide. And with the support of GFAR, over the last year, we've been looking at the future, and especially looking at the future in terms of human capacity development. And just as Chris and others have said already, we recognize that education in the future is going to look a lot different to what it did in the past. And we want to ensure that our universities are actually prepared for that task. And very briefly, interestingly, one of the things that came to the top of our list in terms of what universities should be supporting and doing in terms of the product, the students they produce, the technical knowledge actually was quite far down the list. Well, was down the list. Right at the top of it were things like values and ethics and the kinds of things that makes a good global citizen, the kind of things that lead to a better world, and not the kind of world that some of us that we're experiencing at the present time. So this brings me then to the future, and to connecting those two things, the future and relevance. The future is about our youth. And it was so wonderful today to see such wonderful presentations from the speakers in that regard. But how do we connect the relevance, and the relevance in terms of agriculture and life sciences is usually in the context of food and nutritional security. And we talk about that in both the developed and the developing world. And we seek funding and support for what we do because we say it's important. But if you drill down a little bit, you realize that the population growth is actually occurring primarily in the developing world, especially in Africa and Asia. And so the challenge is not for the developed world to produce the food to ship it to the developing world. The challenge is to actually support the development of capacity in the developing world so that they can produce the food that they need. And central to that, in my view, is human capacity development, which is where the youth come in. So when we look to the future and the need to build a system that is going to increase the food security and nutritional security, we have to think about how do we allow those people in developing countries, how do we support them to get the education and to get the tools that they need. And so building on what my colleagues have said, very specific suggestion, and it has been mentioned already, but just to elaborate a little bit more on it, we know that the CG system is well established in the developing world. And we know that the developed world has certainly many high-powered universities that are at the forefront of science and all the technologies that are needed. But we don't often do a good job of linking those two. It's in a very haphazard fashion. And I'm suggesting a partnership between the CG system and our universities to help make that happen. And one thought in terms of how that might be possible, with the CG system working with universities to identify local talent that would then be connected back to universities in the developing world. And at the same time, students in the developing world be allowed the opportunity to work as part of their graduate work and undergraduate work, in fact. In fact, many of our students spend time abroad in field trips and so on in developing countries, so that they actually understand what the issues are, so that even as they work in the developing world, they'll have a better appreciation of what's needed in Asia and in Africa, and so that the work they'll do as part of their career is more likely to support the needs of the developing world and the growing population. So that is something I would put on the table and welcome your feedback on, is how can the CG system work more closely with the university sector in providing the two-way opportunities for youth in developing countries and youth in developed countries to come together towards providing solutions to the challenges that we face. Thank you.
Thank you very much, all of you. Very, very solid points from earlier this morning discussions. Most of it centered around capacity development and the nature of the capacity development for the future-focused science and development. So, and in addition to that, I will also throw out a few other questions to the floor before the floor can actually bring questions back to the panel. So, again, remembering that, in the morning we talked about, Marianne started talking about and integrating CGIAR and how relevance of science goes towards development and livelihood improvements. We came to a model, a concept of the African agrarian system towards sustainable development goals, and finally we went to prioritization of science through a decision analysis and risks and everything. And now we're coming back to capacity development of youth in a totally different way, which is what every panelist is actually alluding to. So in addition to that, I throw out a few other questions that the team had been discussing, this session team had been discussing. So one is, how do we tailor science for development? This comes back to Marianne's presentation early this morning. We talk about what Ruforum was talking about, CGIAR Alliance, to get young people, not just Moses, but everyone was talking about how, and you were talking about that too, John, about how CGIAR comes together with other organizations and universities to develop the newer generation of young people to cater to the needs of agriculture and development that is beyond just technical skills. And then I also throw out one last question. Considering the scope of what we need to achieve in terms of agricultural development and food security and the sustainable development goals, would it be possible for donors to have a common vision and a common investment towards agricultural development and direct us towards that particular vision as a bigger scope of the entire community together than a piecemeal approach? So those are the questions that I wanted to throw out to the floor, and then I hope that we can bring back the questions to this panel here on the topic of keeping science relevant and future focused. So with that, I open up the questions to the floor. Yes. And then Jenny.
Okay, thank you. I think what we're seeing now, we want a scientist who has kind of T skills. What I mean by that is the vertical T is that he must have enough depth in the discipline. And then the horizontal bar is an adequate knowledge of the requisite skills to solve complex, multidisciplinary global problems. Now, the leadership in the university, I don't hear people talking a lot about leadership. The kind of leadership which is trying to bring these skills is not there. It's the usual pedagogical kind of approach, classroom, which is a dusty and so on. The experiential learning is not happening. So I want to hear what the panel says. By the way, my name is Mafongoya from University of KwaZulu-Natal. Thank you.
I guess I neglected to say that you're exactly right, that earlier when we were talking about the review that we have done in terms of looking at the future of higher education, leadership, entrepreneurship, these are central. And how does one cultivate those attributes in our young people? That is the challenge, I think, that the educational system faces. And it's one that requires a lot of work.
So thank you very much. I think just to, I think I fully agree with you. Ruforum is part of our role is to see how to support universities in terms of transformation, particularly how they can better contribute towards the vision for Africa, in this case, whether the SDGs, Agenda 2063, but it's about how the university, particularly the staff, can get out of their walls and focus more on working together with communities. Now, in this respect, a lot of the issues that you're pulling out is part of the agenda that we have. And I'd like to say that on an ongoing basis, we do have a Vice Chancellors Forum that focuses a lot on supporting them in terms of leadership and management skills. So the next one is planned for October, and we try to spend maybe 2 days or something and focus on some of the issues that you raised. The second issue on experiential learning, again, I fully agree with you, but also I would like to mention that there are ongoing programs as well as activities that are focusing very much in this area. And maybe just to point out possibly one or two, for example, we work a lot with Earth in Costa Rica through, for example, the CGIAR platform, as well as with AgriNatura. And so there are a lot of programs that have been developed that focus very much on ensuring that students have practical experiences and spend time in the field and have these opportunities to actually have practical and experiential learning.
I would like the leadership question is a real one, and it's one that our institutions in the U.S. have recognized, and particularly in agriculture. So a number of years ago, we put in place really 2 programs for emerging faculty leadership. One was basically for those individuals that we could identify that had some nascent leadership skills, but yet not fully developed. And we put a program, it's a 2-year program that enrolls roughly 100 individuals each year. And they go through a very intensive self-evaluation and then start getting some leadership training and skills. That's what I would call kind of an undergraduate program in leadership development. And then with the assistance of the Kellogg Foundation, about 10 years ago, we instituted what we call a Food Leadership Institute. And these are for individuals that are usually at the departmental dean level or department level, associate dean level, but are interested in higher administration positions and moving up the ladder. That too is a 2-year program. It's much more intensive than the undergraduate program that I mentioned, which we call Lead 21. But we have in that cadre of people that enroll in it folks from government, folks from our own institutions, and folks from industry. So we have a good mix of individuals in each cohort for that leadership development.
Jenny next. Jenny, could you introduce yourself first?
Yes, I'm Jenny Dade-Pryke, and I had a large part of my career with FAO, but a little bit with the CG system. But after retiring, I'm working with GFAR on gender issues. But my background is much beyond gender. I wanted to come to this question that Shobha asked about how do we tailor science for development. And I'd like to play devil's advocate. I missed, unfortunately, Marianne's presentation, but from the rest of the discussion, as a social scientist, I see the discussion is very top-down and supply-driven. And my big concern is, why don't we start with development instead of the science? Why don't we look at the people, the different people in the world, what they would like as development? But people are not homogeneous. And, if we go, whether we're looking abroad, between cities and rural areas or within rural areas, we need to look at people who are big landowners or big livestock owners, those who are landless. In India, you have a huge number of landless laborers working in agriculture, and they're living desperately badly. They're some of the poorest and the most hungry, the most malnourished. Then we have gender issues, which are hugely important. We're mentioning youth, thank goodness, but, young men and young women have completely different opportunities in life because of gender roles, gender expectations, stereotypes, and so on. And I would be much happier if we could see somehow we get in a way of getting hold of these stakeholders so that we're serving them and we're not like being supply driven. Okay.
Right, good question, thank you. Yes.
Yeah, I'd like to respond on the first part, at least, of the question. I totally agree on the principle that as much as possible our system of research and education should move from a supply-driven system to a demand-driven system. And I think that easily we can agree on the words for that. But when you go in details on how it can be handled, it's tricky actually in the research system and in the education system to be able to respond to some direct problems raised by development stakeholders from the ground for different reasons. The first of them is that problems can be expressed by these organizations, NGOs working on the field, finding some problems and raising the problems, looking for scientists in the research institution that can handle that, etc., etc. On the principle, it's good. But a problem raised by a development institution, in most of the cases, will never be a research question. At best, it can be translated in a number of research questions that can be handled afterwards in research programs. So there is a need of having a system that transforms the problems expressed by the grassroots organizations or development organization or extension or NGOs, etc., or the farmers organization also, into topics that can be handled in research programs or that can become topics for students doing their internship or doing their master thesis or their PhD on those issues. And that needs collaboration between the stakeholders in development and the research. It cannot be done by one of the two partners only. It wouldn't work. Therefore, their collaboration will be needed.
Yeah, and there is Wayne and then Ido. And before that, I just want to throw it out to Jenny too. Jenny, the country consultations that the CGIAR is doing for site integration brings in national consultations and national level priorities. So to some extent, that would be captured if we include all of the different level of partners in each country consultations. It's just.
Look, we all know, as kids, we all played that game, I whisper something to my partner, who whispers it on and on and on. And at the end, it's rubbish, okay? So,
how do we do that?
We used to also talk directly with these people. And one does, a lot of research is done with the men and the women themselves. A lot of that research is being done, thanks, in the CG system. I know people doing it. I've read their reports. They actually are talking to them. There are ways of doing it, if one wants to.
Yeah, we do that too. We have large numbers of surveys and stakeholder consultations and group discussions going on. So yes, you've got that very correct. The CG system does do that. Yeah. Wayne. Yeah.
So if I could comment on the question and perhaps present it slightly differently, I think that. What we are faced with now, and as was described in the first session of the conference, are global challenges, and those global challenges don't respect national boundaries. And in fact, many of the challenges that are now being faced in the developing world are also faced in the developed world. And therefore, that's creating some really, really unique opportunities. So it's not simply as binary as it was in the past. And I think this is an opportunity, certainly if we look at what Marianne was presenting this morning around the innovation agenda, to be thinking about this slightly differently, because these challenges are global and they need international and global solutions. And I think that is one of the things I think that is really fundamental to the sort of conversations we're having, and particularly looking to the future.
Do we take these questions and then come back to the panel? Yes. Ido next, and then I'll
Thanks.
come to you. Ido?
So I'd like to ask one or one and a half somewhat provocative question to this illustrious panel representing universities from different geographical areas, but also different thematical areas. Are the universities today out of touch with the market needs? I mean, it's not uncommon that we see in a country huge graduate unemployment figures, while at the same time private sector can't get qualified workers. Does that mean the model is broken? If it's not, why do we see this disconnect? If it is broken, how do we fix it? And a related question to that is, how do you perceive the universities acting on the technological changes that have swept and will continue to sweep all our lives? So for example, what experience do you have in adaptation of MOOCs, massive online open courses, in blended courses within that? And the changing role of faculty, from professors who are to do A to Z, including course development from scratch, each on their own, into some centralized form of high quality content development with then good facilitation locally to reduce costs and to standardize the quality of the education. Do we need to aim for this elite model that everyone does everything from end to end? In Switzerland, for instance, not everyone goes to university. There's a very good apprenticeship system and the economy functions quite well. Is that something that we can look at? Thank you.
And, yeah, this gentleman here. Here you go.
Okay, thank you. I'm James Kungo from Kenya, where I'm also the chair for ANAFE Aircraft. I'm teaching at Kenyatta University. One thing I want to comment, there is a question you ask, how do we keep science relevant and future focused? I think one of the things that we can be able to do, we can also be able to learn from the success stories, both of what has been done by universities and also what has been done by CG's centers. I had a chance to study in Philippines, University of Philippines, Los Banos, where we know ILI, Internationalized Research Institute, is located. And I always used to admire, as a postgraduate student, the openness of the ILI to students, that I could go and spare, just using my student ID, use the library, and even use the facilities within ILI. And out of that, we know ILI, especially on the aspect of rice, they train all people, especially Southeast and even Southeast Asia and even South Asia. And no wonder when you go to a country like Vietnam, you find, and even Thailand, you find the impact as far as food production is concerned is quite high. My biggest challenge is, especially to the CG centers that are located in Africa, how open are they, how collaborative are they to the students who are working and studying within the continent? Okay, when it comes to aspect of collaboration, research collaboration, I can mention we had a project, two projects. One of it is the African Nuances, where we had a collaboration from Wageningen University, Reading, and many others. And out of that, you could be able to see, since we are able also to bring on board the NARIs, the impact that that had on the communities, because our research was working on the community. ANAFE, we have a very nice program. We call it UniBrain. And when you look at the UniBrain within the continent of how making the agriculture acceptable to the youth, coming up with business plan where youth are able to do hands-on, you can be able to see the impact that it has had. So I'm saying, let us learn from the best practices and what has succeeded in the past. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. So,
I'm going to come back to the question back there.
Ido. So, yeah.
The question is, are our institutions out of touch? Some are, and some faculty are. No question about it. You know, one of the hardest things to do that I certainly found in institutions is to try and institute change. It's very, very difficult in that faculty culture. There's no question about it, because faculty live in silos. And those silos many times are discipline-oriented. And if I had my way, I'd probably do away with departments completely. And one said, well, why? And I said, well, why do we have departments? And they said, well, they got to preserve the discipline. I said, preserve it for whom? And for what? So I think there are those issues there. But in many ways, I think it depends upon the leadership that you have in your institution. But one of the things we're doing at APLU, which we are just launching, is looking at the real issues and the challenges out there, particularly around the food system out in 2050. And we have gotten a small grant from Kellogg Foundation to put together a commission to look at the ways in which our institutions need to change themselves and the way they operate and work, not only internally, but internally and externally, to be able to meet some of those challenges. That's going to be a very interesting project moving forward. Yes, new technologies come along, and some of them get adopted, and some of them work well, and those that work well usually get instituted along the way. Those that don't often disappear. But we need to be able to prepare ourselves for a continual wave of that kind of thing happening.
I'd like to respond to James from Kenya. You know, I head up the Southern African Regional Office of IMI, and I get a number of applications for internships. They all come from Europe, particularly Holland. The Dutch have really got it nailed. They have the most fantastic internship or extension kind of training programs. We get nothing from Africa. People don't ask to come to us for internships. And if they do, then they want a huge salary as well. And, you know, those two things, especially, you know, in South Africa, the interns expect a proper salary. And that basically kills the whole system. So there's a lot of adjustment that needs to be done. I think internship is the most fantastic program. I had one girl from the UK who was with me a few months ago, and she got a real problem. Well, it's transformed her life. She's now changed her whole career. She wants to spend the rest of her life doing that little project that she had for 3 months. She wants to extend for the rest of her life because it was real. Internships are really fantastic, and we're failing students by not actually providing them more and better.
As always, Idor, you asked some pretty good questions. And I would, in answer, like Ian has said, I would say, yes, some institutions are not producing what's required in the marketplace. And this is one of the things that was identified as part of our review of curriculum. Those institutions that are successful are those that have not just changed the way they teach or the educational system, they've also broadened the meaning of agriculture as being very different to what we thought about it 50 years ago. Agriculture, as we look at it now and in the future, I think has to be much more broadly defined, that goes from food production right through to nutrition to human health. And as somebody said yesterday, I think, the challenge that and the opportunity that we have in agriculture is to be seen as a solution provider. If we look at the chronic diseases that plague the world and the cost of those chronic diseases, almost all of them have a strong food or nutritional component. How do we change our agricultural system to be so that it's seen and actually does contribute to better nutritional security? And in our own institution, in the 100 years that we've been in existence, we went from a single program which was all about agriculture, food production, to today, where the program with the highest numbers of students are actually nutrition and food science and environmental sciences. So again, all of those things fall very nicely within the broad definition of agriculture. And if we take that approach, we will have students knocking on our doors, and they'll be seeing a future in what they're doing and what they're going to do in the future, rather than the more traditional a definition of agriculture that we've had sometimes in the past.
Ido, you also asked about technological advances. And to say that, yes, I believe that, well, first of all, I guess the answer has to be taken with a pinch of salt, because I would also answer probably in a similar way in terms of whether universities are out of touch or not. And one also has to recognize the challenges that universities have in terms of their capacity to transform, particularly in Africa. I think over and above beyond the issues about themselves really wanting to transform or not. But also to mention very quickly before I come back to the MOOCs and so on, that of those big numbers that I was talking about, 200,000 and so on within each of the higher education sectors within the countries, two particular points. One is that of those, probably 1 to 2% are within agriculture. So it's not, when you start looking at the character of those numbers, you find only a very small proportion is within agriculture, which might also be a pointer to whether they're in or out of touch. Secondly, I would also like to say that postgraduate research is being held at ransom by undergraduate training. So a large proportion of that number, again, is in undergraduate training. Most of them are undergraduates, and very few are going to the postgraduate sector. And largely this also comes from the funding. If you see funding to universities, a large amount is going towards the cost of staff rather than towards research or other activities. Now, coming back to the advances, universities pay a lot for example, ICT, access to ICT and so on and so forth. Some even up to $10,000 per month that they pay for access to ICT services. Now, of late, of course, there are many innovations, for example, through the RENUs, the Research and Education Networks, that are trying to improve access to ICTs. So again, a lot of these new advances can now be harnessed because of access now to better ICT. But one may also argue whether MOOCs are the best approach or not. I think the jury is still out whether this is the best way, but certainly blended approaches and use of ICTs, OERs, and so on and so forth, that certainly would be very useful. Just one last comment about gender, which I think is a very difficult issue for many universities, because again, when you start talking about postgraduate training, this is also the age when many of the young ladies and the women are getting into the reproductive stage. And again, a lot of development partners are not supporting some of the facilities that would facilitate many women to study. So many times you find a young lady who has a child immediately after she begins her studies has no mechanism of maybe having an extra ticket to go home and so on and so forth. So there are many challenges. We're happy to see now, for example, the EU3, the Intra-Africa program, and many others are beginning to put this in place. Sorry.
That's okay. Thank you. Thanks. All right, that's the last one, because we are running over time and Wayne's session is coming up. Yes, here you go.
Thank you. I'm Sohna Rokhaya Gaye from Senegal. You will allow me to speak in French. Maybe Moses will translate for you. Oh, you understand French? Huh? No. Sorry, but I will speak in French. Le point particulier que je voudrais souligner, c'est surtout ce problème de langage. Parce que c'est un problème crucial, en fait, pour les étudiants qui sont dans les pays francophones. Parce que la plupart des programmes PhD demandent à avoir des compétences en anglais. Généralement, on nous demande d'avoir le TOEFL ou quelque chose comme ça. Donc, je demande au CGI de voir quelles stratégies ils peuvent mettre en place pour ces jeunes francophones qui veulent faire leur PhD et qui ont ce problème de langage. L'autre problème, Moses l'a souligné tout de suite, je voulais intervenir juste sur le problème de genre par rapport à cette différence des opportunités qui sont offertes aussi bien aux hommes et aux femmes. Par exemple, je vous donne mon cas, par exemple, concret. Je commence mon PhD. OK. Et entre-temps, j'ai un bébé. Je coupe tout. Parce qu'en fait, le système ne me permet pas de continuer avec ce bébé. Il y a les raisons sociales, il y a les raisons professionnelles. Donc, je propose aussi, pour ce point, au CGI, de voir quelles stratégies ils vont prendre. Peut-être faire des enquêtes sur les réalités socioculturelles et voir à partir de ces réalités quelles stratégies mettre en place pour permettre aux femmes qui s'engagent dans la recherche de pouvoir terminer leur recherche en doctorat. Merci.
Thank you. Didier?
See if you can translate also. So there were two questions raised, actually. One, the first one is about the problem of language, and you expressed the problem that many Francophone students may have in their universities for starting studies at a higher level, especially in connection with research, where for continuing in that domain in research, you need to master the English at a certain level, which is out of the capacity of a large number of students. So there is a call to the CG, I don't know whether the CG is the right place for calling for that, to set up some specific strategy for Francophone students to participate in international research. The second issue is with regard to the gender issue that was raised, and a testimony of personal situation, a difficulty of handling both the family life when you are undertaking a PhD and having a baby, and having to deal with two objectives, and the need of taking into account the real situation, social situation of most of the female PhD students in this context.
Thank you. Yeah? Yes? All right. Okay. So the one thing that we did not get fully addressed was Wayne's point by the panel. I think it boils down to the kind of technology and science for the future. But I think we have more sessions that are coming through, and we can address that there. So basically, capacity building for the future, sustainable capacity building for the future, and taking into consideration all of the factors, not just the technology, but the values, the ethics, the soft skills, all of that. We talked about this should not be a top-down thing, but it should be bottom up as well. We talked about the leadership gap that is currently existing. We talked about learning from current experiences. It raised the question about the gap between existing needs and the untrained people that are still there, and also about newer ways of addressing reaching larger people, such as larger number of people, such as MOOCs. And then the last one about the gender and the language. So a variety of topics that have been brought up for future relevant science and development. And our session continues through this afternoon and on Friday. So with these as the primary questions that are of concern to the participants and all of us, I think we'll focus on those, and we'll bring it to some level of actionable items towards the end of this session. If I have not captured anything that was mentioned here, please let me know, and we'll capture that into our minutes. So once again, thank you to all of the panelists and all of the participants here. And before you leave, I am supposed to present something to the panelists. So let me do that. Yeah. Come on.
No, go ahead. On behalf of Dickens. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you for the session. Thank you, John.